On the Peterson question, Ben Burgis is in his Give Them an Argument YouTube channel has recently shown a class session where he does a short quasi takedown of Peterson from the point of view of the Zizekian, or let's say an intelligent radical rather than progressive. Maybe there's some overlap between the standard progressivism as in Roberto Unger at the Harvard Law School and radicalism as Zizekianism, and the allies of Zizekianism seem to sometimes present themselves as being, although they're often willing to, if challenged, to announce that they're merely bourgeois, rather than some kind of people ready to stage an armed insurrection or whatever. So I thought the presentation was like better than you'd get from just if you took somebody off the street, and better if you got somebody who had no training whatsoever, but otherwise very bad. Nonetheless, I felt it was helpful. So first of all, as a matter of methodos, or a principled way of moving forward, we should say, when judging of a philosophic teaching or somebody presenting themselves as giving a philosophic teaching, we should attempt to see what they are saying, rather than to accuse them of making errors. So, like, for instance, Karl Popper, if he says, well, Platon has been born into an aristocratic Athenian family, that of Solon, and a long tradition of hereditary aristocrats, and therefore he's likely to have certain biases. Then, instead of listening to Plato's teaching, we assume in advance a measure which then gives Plato in this Procrustean version, and constantly suspects him of having committed this error. Or otherwise, we could also do similar things from a Freudian perspective. Plato's outraged Athenian consciousness is displaying some kind of symptoms which he's trying to suppress by going to rationality and going against the dreams of an Athenian, as he, in order to better suppress them, mentions briefly in the Politeia Republic, and where Freud, of course, picks up on this, etc., etc. Instead of listening to the teaching, we bring in something else. So I think Burgess does this to Peterson, and as do so many people, as is in a way natural to do, by saying Peterson has made an error in his usage of his oft wielded instrument, the totem or symbol or word Marxism. So, but instead, what we should do is, instead of saying this is what Marxism means, so far as we're to say, take Marxism to be the red letter rubric, which names the teaching of Karl Marx, and this is what Karl Marx says, and anyone who uses the word Marxism in a different way has committed an error. Instead of that, we should derive the meaning from the usage of the person we assume to be giving a teaching which might be the truth. So then when we do that, then we have to ask ourselves, what is Peterson actually using this word to mean? So then the confusion does arise naturally, that to some extent Peterson himself is confused and tries to claim that he's speaking of the historical Karl Marx, as evidenced by his embarrassingly silly, totally lacking in all intellectual culture reading ad hoc of Marx's Communist Manifesto, which anyway was a work of the young student Marx at the time of 1848 revolutions, but also which Peterson, having no philological culture, having no sense of the requirements of correctly understanding a text according to its time, did exactly what people like Howard Zinn do. He did a kind of presentism. He said, let's read this manifesto as though it were said in 2020 or whenever that, as Zizek called it, unfortunate debate took place. And then let's denounce Marx as a fool, instead of realizing that he was talking in totally different conditions of just prior to the 1848 revolutions, and making all kinds of other saving gestures, checking to see if a certain term, the translation, reading properly. A classical philologist is not going to give a public account on a text that he hasn't read in the original language, and of which he doesn't know the original language very well. Of course, Peterson did not read the text in German, and also he's not going to give a text on somebody, a lecture on a text that he has no particular insight into. Okay, maybe he claims to have particular insight into Marx. I don't know. I don't think that he does. But in any case, let's say Marxism for Peterson is partially mistaken in his own usage, because he acts as though he were giving an account of Marx, where he couldn't do that unless we would rule out the possibility of classical philology actually correctly saying what the text said, and at least to a better standard than somebody doing a presentist history can, at least to the standard of somebody who is all the time telling us that like Howard Zinn does, that Christopher Columbus was very aware that he was doing genocide, and that this was a terrible crime against humanity, just as when Netanyahu does whatever he does today. Even Netanyahu today doesn't seem to be particularly cognizant of this, how do they call this, removal of this removal of people as a form of from their territory as a great crime, because he also gave a lot of weapons to the Azerbaijanis to remove the Armenians from their historical territory, which is a kind of ethnic cleansing. I suppose ethnic cleansing covers not only extermination or killing outright, but also removal of people from their ancestral homeland and so forth. But let's just look at how does. So as a matter of methodology, we should try to derive the meaning of this word Marx from Peterson's own usage, and then we could see how is he actually using the word. It seems to me the way he's using the word is best explicated by looking at the most powerful political dispute of his time, which he's clearly taken the side of Trump. So, like, for instance, he was on some English talk show saying that the Abraham Accords were worthy of the Nobel Prizes, which I sort of don't, I won't bother to just go against that, because they gave the Nobel Prize to Bob Dylan, who was a very low stature, even though everybody enjoys his music, but everybody enjoys the music of, like, Sting and the Police too, right? Everybody enjoys the music of Bobby McFerrin or whatever, Don't Worry, Be Happy, but is it really giving a serious and thoroughly thought through teaching to human beings in the way that other Nobel Prize winners had in earlier times? Hermann Hesse, for instance, who was perhaps even the least of the great Nobel Prize winner. Parlagravist was a very solid Nobel Prize winner, who was very thoughtful teaching or reflections that he presents to human beings to ponder. But nonetheless, supposing Peterson means this to say this is the great thing Trump did, I think this is a sign that he has taken one side in this so-called cultural divide, and then culture comp, whatever. And of course, that's the Trump side against, which is the media has given the color red to the color blue to the more passive color, the color blue to the Democrats. Unconscious bias shows if a red car is coming towards you, you artificially judge it to be faster than a blue car. Or studies on unconscious bias show that. I think, therefore, then we could start to think about what is the red side for and what is the blue side for, and then see Peterson's use of the word Marxism in this context, and then we kind of get a better sense of what he means by the term and what he means by the Marxist professors. The Marxist professors are then the ones that are on the blue side and promoting the blue things, as against the ones on the red side promoting the red things. And I think we should start then to understand what this divide is about through the Stadt Luft macht frei slogan of the Middle Ages, which meant that city air makes free, which was said because you could kind of get out of serfdom by coming to a town, and in the towns there were the medieval corporations or guilds, and there were other things going on, and the freedom consisted of living in the town and being able to do the work that you wanted to do rather than being on the being brought in by a knight to go to war, or being part of the agricultural serf and peasant populations. When the whole of society starts to gravitate towards city life and towards economics that are about this question of freedom as the right to work, then you get, like in the 1848 period, this Louis Blanc coining the word capitalism. So remember, Carl Schmitt thinks that all the important concepts that we use are polemical concepts. So in this way, we turn Peterson's concept Marxism simply into a polemical political concept. I find that the felicitous way to deal with it. So Schmitt had said that society was originally a polemical concept because of the absolutism of Louis XIV was opposed by the notion that the state could be divided into laïcité and law. So the state could be understood. I am the state, as Louis XIV said. So we could say, here's Louis XIV, and then there's something else, another entity called society, which opposes that, which is somehow faces towards it, but it remains in some way free from it. And this is the origin of the idea of social contract, and the idea of, later on in American usage, we get a lot of talk about government being bad as late as in the 80s with Reagan. Was kind of the last big burst of that, as against, but I don't think necessarily that Reagan used the phrase great society or society as opposed from that, but probably he would say something like free enterprise is good, or I'm not sure exactly what phrases he would use, but the point is that the notion of free enterprise or entrepreneurial competition, or free, I guess maybe it would be a free market, is only an idea very specific to the politics of the post-French Revolution in France, and that wasn't part of the politics of the early American order, because most people still in Lincoln's time, people assumed to strive to work for themselves. If you look even in this, a late work on this, which appears slightly, in Zizek's term, kitschy, but it's still a beautiful work, is the Devlin Daniel Webster, which was, I think, the film with Walter Houston, who plays very charmingly the devil. Came out in the 30s, and it recalls when the thing was no longer believed in, but yet still in a strong, nice, artistic way. This notion that work as freedom means working for oneself as a homesteader, and as soon as the devil comes in, then you get the entrepreneurs who find out that it's better not to work, but rather to get other people to work for you, and that's the origin of evil in this Devil and Daniel Webster allegory. But this is probably not the real juxtaposition. The real juxtaposition is that there's de facto this situation where there are people working for people, but the question Louis Blanc raises is it that people have a right to work? So, and then the side that comes out against this keeps saying, is the side that's maybe even sometimes in its own view, I think somehow in a secret kind of perverse way, obscene way, the obscene underbelly, as Zizek would call it. They sort of view themselves as endorsing the Horatio Alger version, pulling oneself up from the bootstraps, which is supposed to be sort of like originally a joke, like the idea of Baron Munchausen tightening his thighs around his horse and then using the thighs to levitate the horse up into the air and fly. An impossible act. So, but it seems, but one that is somehow imaginable. So it's a fantasy thing, and once this reaches the level of fantasy, you do have this I don't know, ideological bug running rampant. But on the other hand, there's a realist version, which is basically, and it's expressed also in fiction. It's so it's like the Powell Memorandum, for instance, from the 1971, that Chomsky is always so psychotically, I would say, against. But in a way, it just means he's a priori against it. So he's at least psychotic from the current horizon of thinking, I would say, because he's a priori against this in the following sense. The Powell Memorandum is simply argumentation in favor, reasonable argumentation in favor of the free enterprise system. That's basically what it is. And then it's saying these and these forces are threatening the free enterprise system. But so far as we take the Louis Blanc side, free enterprise system must read capitalism, and capitalism doesn't read like capitalism as against Soviet socialism, but it reads rather simply capitalism is something bad from the point of Louis Blanc, and he coined the term just as at one time the term government or state was coined as a counter term against society, as in other words, as an enemy of the people. He coined Louis Blanc thinks capitalism is the enemy. So, but the enemy of what? So the enemy apparently of the right to work. So the right to work would mean something like Roosevelt or the National Socialists, who were socialists in exactly this Louis Blanc sense, the German evoke of the right to work. And so then they build Autobahn or whatever public works programs. And it's exactly this that the current political ideas kind of spin around. And so in this sense, the right wing is correct to say that they are against all forms of National Socialism, Nazism, and they're also against Roosevelt. They hate Roosevelt, some of them. So the reason being they are against the right to work. Instead, they think there's the Horatio Alger, pull yourself up through the bootstraps, which is then also understood as some kind of social Darwinism. So in this sense, we should understand Peterson speaking of Marxism as simply, basically he's saying, I'm against the right to work. And then you could see, because that would mean that the government has to come in and artificially shift around the jobs that exist, and in some way manage the economy more directly. The enemy of Louis Blanc was basically some guy kind of like Milton Friedman, is basically Friedrich Bastiat was basically like a Milton Friedman type of guy that was for total libertarian free market and even against any kind of mercantilism or protectionism. Trump is in favor of protectionism. That's used as a strategical instrument or as a kind of toolbox of things that the executive can use to influence the economy. That's done in Germany, by the way, because Germany keeps high employment simply artificially by putting tariffs on the industries that are suffering. Trump tried to do that in a very pathetic and inept way in the steel companies in America, because the steel companies were so dead by the time he put the tariff. All the tariff did is do what Milton Friedman doesn't like, which is make it harder for Americans to buy cheap steel from China, which would have benefited all kinds of other companies, but not the steel company. But it didn't benefit the steel company either, because the steel companies were already kaput. They already had no chance of competing with the Chinese. It was too late. So it was a bad policy in every way. But nonetheless, it could be used, as Germany shows in current Germany shows, in a way that helps the specific country. But of course, if we think about it in terms of like world system theory, Wallerstein, then we realize helping a specific country isn't so great, because we're also interconnected. That if one country gets more employed, that's nice for that locality and it's nice for those people, but it harms the global system as a whole. And since the global system is so connected, it actually shakes back and harms even the Germans, but just in different ways, in more butterfly effect type of ways, but often in ways that can be concretely demonstrated, but it would just be more minute modulations would be needed that would take a long time to illustrate. So, okay, taken that way, I think this is my general plaint with Peterson, is I think he's too political. But then the question arises is it necessary to be political, or is there also a philosophic perspective? And that's a good point to, I think, begin with. From if we could gain anything from this attempt to envisage what's happening with the popular media stars who present themselves as somehow intellectual authorities, and try to lead groups forward, and who do so in a way which is sometimes seems to be galling by the standards of all the old races of the professoriate, including, I mean, the ones I have the highest estimate of, the highest esteem for, would be classicists, or otherwise understood, classical scholars of Greek and Latin, and of classical philologists who, with the like skills, read German texts and read the text of the philosophic tradition. But there's other such races, other such genuses, or in Jakob Burckhardt's sense, other such sort of groups, like the Jesuits, who have reproduced the group as something more important than the individual scholars' reproduction of their own gene line, but the group being something that lives on beyond the specific Jesuit, or beyond the specific classical scholar. These are the places where we seem to get any standard at all which then we could look at the popular things that are popular at the market version of the daily plebiscite, and then say, it doesn't meet these standards. I still support those standards through my esteem of Leo Strauss and others who, and many classical scholars, people on the model of Benjamin Jowett, or just any classical scholar who speaks the language, who solves all kinds of problems in terms of translation, and who basically keeps the possibility of speaking directly to the authors of the ancient texts, and thereby the tradition, open. These seem to me still a high standard, and yet we see such a powerful contest in the sense of, I think I gave the example recently, well, that somebody can write a book, say Karl Popper, which pleases no Plato scholar, but which pleases a lot of people for political reasons. Say the guy who's writing all these anthropology books that died, David Graeber. He's the perfect example. He's like an academic bandit. So everything he writes is from a progressive point of view. He admits the logical fallacy of his whole view, because he says all the cultures are just different and none are superior, and yet he admits that he comes from the culture that views this difference rather than hierarchy as the truth, as the culmination of the pattern. In other words, that there were the people that didn't believe in that, and then Boas and Malinowski came along, and then people started, and Wittgenstein gave philosophic support, and then people started believing that, and he takes over that position as the culmination of the tradition, and yet at the same time he says there can be no hierarchy of cultures and none can be higher. So that's the out and out fraudulent position, but what can he do? He does say truly what he's doing, and then from there he goes on to write books as though he were giving some kind of scientific treatment on anthropology, but they're really just texts that out and out in this almost Oliver Wendell Holmesian sense, just like says there's no such thing as law, there's only politics. He says there's no such thing as the field of anthropology, there's only different political takes on these things.